But there you go. So I reckon it's worth mentioning abductive arguments. What's an abductive argument? An abductive argument is an inference to the best to the best explanation. Okay, so here we are really going to be dealing with two hypotheses that are competing for our attention. Okay, the hypothesis.
Hold on a second, Jonathan. Yeah. Best here could be simplest. The simplest is that does it borrow a bit from Occam?
Okay, park that for a second. So the best here is, so which hypothesis best explains the data? So for example, if you've got naturalistic atheism against omni-god theism, and we're just about to talk about omni-god in a second, but just bear with me. So you've got omni-god theism and naturalistic atheism, and then you've got any data, and then you say, right, which either predicts the data better or better explains the data. So, for example, you might look again at pain and suffering, carnivorousness. Let's just take that randomly and say, right, if I didn't know anything, right, and I was like, what would I predict the world to look like on naturalistic atheism, where we've got like evolution by natural selection, all those sorts of mechanisms, and when we've got omni-god, who is supposedly all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, what would I predict the world to be like? Would I predict carnivorousness? No, I wouldn't. I predict that on naturalistic atheism, but I wouldn't predict it on omni-god theism. Okay, so then predictions aside, then we look at all the data and say, oh, which explanation better explains this? Well, naturalistic atheism explains it perfectly well. Omni-god theism, you have to jump through hoops in order to make carnivorousness kind of make sense under that theory. And therefore, abduction here just tells you that, well, just it's more likely that naturalistic atheism is true. It's more predictive, and it better explains the data. And then when you keep doing this, so I've got 30 arguments here that don't necessarily disprove God in and of themselves in a deductive manner, because I think if you've got a successful deductive argument, you wouldn't have believers or you wouldn't have atheists, because the deductive argument would seal the deal, right? So abductive arguments come and step in and say, okay, well, I produced 30 arguments here, and each of these arguments show that naturalistic atheism is more likely. Therefore, we are far more rationally justified in believing naturalistic atheism. So that's the kind of approach I'm going to be taking. Any thoughts? Any thoughts to that?
Oh, I completely. I mean, like, abductive argument is being adopted in science at the moment. It's obviously was inference, and inductive argument, inductive logic is very strong in science, but abductive reasoning as well in science is quite prevalent. I don't know. Have you heard of a director called Darren Aronofsky? He's the one who directed Noah and Mother with Jennifer Lawrence. These are theologically
right. Yes, I do. Yeah.
In the movie Noah with the Aussie Russell Crowe, there was the beginning of the scenes. This is sort of the beginning of humanity. Noah is not one of the closest, supposed to be closest prophets to Adam, and there are scenes where there were people chasing an animal in order to hunt him down and probably eat him, and that was frowned down upon. Because it was supposed to be, everybody's supposed to be vegetarian. And in the movie, they were showing people who brought evil on earth were mainly meat eaters. Some Christians argue that with the introduction of evil by men, things like that, like eating the flesh of other animals, were introduced as well by man. But when Jesus comes back again, the very infamous picture of the lion with the lamb, and things will be put right again. So there are some that are arguing that evil is man-made because we brought symbolic evil, and therefore the ritual of eating meat.
This is the original sin theodicy, right? So the idea, what explains suffering on earth in the context of, say, carnivorousness. And Christians might say original sin. But then in order to do that, you have to, one, establish that the Adam and Eve story is literally true. And two, you have to explain all the data that shows that carnivorousness existed far, far, far before the existence of hominids, right? So, yes, you can say that, but you would get short shrift from someone like myself because actually it doesn't accord with any of the known data of that we have with the world. And of course, the problem is it's only a hop, skip and a jump away from young Earth creationism. And of course, if you're prepared to believe in young Earth creationism, you're not using the same rational faculties as I am, and we can't really have a conversation. Like I think I've got to that stage in my life now where I don't bother too much with debating young Earth creationists because there's nothing I can say. Like I can present you with all the rational evidence. I talk about this. I talked about this last night actually. So how to understand why young Earth creationists will reject rational evidence is to understand something called terror management theory or mortality salience. So this is the understanding of our own mortality. Now, if you are a believer in heaven and hell, and again, these are arguments we'll get onto eventually, like you are thinking you're going to exist in heaven for eternity, right? So this is a huge carrot. And if you think, well, if I disbelieve, then I might go to hell, which is like the biggest stick you can be hit with in human conception. What that means is if you're a young Earth creationist and I present to you rational argumentation that the Earth is older than 6,000 years old, that young Earth creationist is not evaluating that evidence on a basis of its own intrinsic merits. That young Earth creationist is evaluating that evidence in terms of whether that will invalidate him from going to heaven or not. So therefore, they will reject evidence against, evidence against the young Earth because actually they won't go to heaven for eternity if they take that on. So this becomes a psychological thing rather than evaluating rational evidence. So that's why, it's so difficult to disabuse people like young Earth creationists of their position, because by doing that, you are saying you're not going to go to heaven forever.